Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our virtual book talk, The Political Logic of Taxation in China. My name is Lynette Ong. So I direct the China Governance Lab at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy and Asian Institute. So at the China Governance Lab, we organize a series of events and run, fellowship for graduate students and so on. If you're interested in China-related type of research and activities, please follow us on LinkedIn and also follow us on Twitter with Asian Institute and the Munk School. So let me introduce the speakers for today. We are very, very pleased to have with us the author of the book, The Political Logic of Taxation in China, Governing and Ruling, which I have a copy here. So the author, Professor Changdong Zhang, is a professor and chair of Department of Political Science at the School of Government of Peking University. He received his PhD in political science from University of Washington, Seattle. Professor Zhang's research interests include taxation politics, fiscal sociology, taxation and state and society relationships, and institutionalism with a regional focus on China. His papers have appeared in various journals, including China Quarterly, Governance, Sociological Theory, Politics and Society, and many other Chinese journals. In my view, he is one of the very few people working in the China space who really understand how taxation works in China. As evidence of that, only partial evidence, he has got, aside from this book, which was published by University of Michigan in 2011, in 2021, which is the subject of our book talk today. He also has a co-authored book with Xiaobo Li at Berkeley, a forthcoming book out later this year called Taxation and Governance in Contemporary China. We're also very pleased to have Professor Ling Chen as a discussant today. She is William Clayton Chair and Associate Professor at the School of Advanced and International Studies at Johns Hopkins Universities. She is a prolific scholar, one of the best, I think, political economists working on China. Her articles have appeared in many places, including the American Journal of Political Science, Comparative Politics, International Securities, International Studies Quarterly, New Political Economy, Perspective on Politics, Politics and Society, so on and so forth. Her book, Manipulating Globalization, the Influence of Bureaucrats on Business in China, was published by Stanford University Press. So I'm also very pleased to have a signed copy with me today. So very good. So this is a 1 hour talk. I'll hand it over to the author and then followed by discussion.
Thank you, Lynette. Thank you for having me here, and thank you, Lin, for joining us, and everybody for joining us on the later night of Thursday. Now I'm going to sharing with my screen. Okay, so as Lynette just mentioned, it's kind of like the book has been published for 4 years, and kind of like I'm so happy that there are still people interested in the book. So I'm go quickly through the book in like about 30 minutes. So here is the table of contents. It has 7 chapters, and I selectively go through some topics in details while quickly go through others. Okay, so the research question for the book is that it's kind of like a very general one. It's why some authoritarian regimes could be sustained, why others cannot. Or if we put the question in on another side, why some countries get democratized, why others cannot. And China turns out to be a very interesting case because in the last 4 or maybe like about 5 decades, China has experienced a market transition, which means China used to have a planned economy, and now it's not a pure or perfect market economy, but it's a partial market economy now. And associated with the market transition, there is a tax state transition. So which means 40 years ago or 50 years ago, the government did not need to tax the people directly. Most of the tax revenues come from state-owned enterprises, but now the government needed to tax its people, the private enterprises and the citizens. All of these transitions kind of like raise new challenges for the Chinese government. And according to the theories, market transition, rapid economic development, industrialization, all of these will lead to democratization. So China turns out to be a very interesting case to examine. Okay, so regardless of all of the transitions and the changes, the Chinese government or the Chinese Communist Party remains a very resilient, like authoritarian regime. So why? So before we go to explain what's happening, let's kind of like try to define the regime resilience. So regime resilience is different from regime survival because regime survival is a simpler issue. It's just a matter of maintaining power over an extended period of time. But the regime resilience is something more demanding. It's not only about survival, but it's also about thrive and adapt while fostering the growth of national military and economic power. Right, so it's in Chinese. The party says it's about 长治久安. Right, so this is kind of like a very good translation for authoritarian regime resilience. In other words, the party not only rules, it also governs, right? So I got the inspiration for the book title from this book. It's mostly on African countries. It's ruling but not governing. So I think so far the Chinese Communist Party is ruling, at the same time it's also governing well. The party is loved and feared at the same time. And my argument, borrowing the insights from fiscal sociology, I argue that the Chinese taxation system plays an important role in resolving or alleviating the authoritarian governance problems and the dilemmas, which I will introduce in details later, and therefore contributes to regime resilience through different mechanisms. Okay, so there has been huge amount of literature explaining for democratization as well as for authoritarian resilience. So I have a very quick review of the institutional turn of authoritarian resilience, and then also about the existing research on taxation and authoritarian resilience. So for the political science has experienced an institutional turn of authoritarian studies in the last 2 decades. And there are many explanations, mostly institutional explanations, try to explain for authoritarian resilience. So institutions like coercive and repressive institutions had been emphasized for many decades to explain for the regime survival and the resilience. I think it also including Lynette's recent book, Outsourcing Repression. And besides the coercive institutions, co-optation is also regarded as very, very important in maintaining authoritarian rule. So democratic-looking institutions like the legislature, party, and the elections are also have been emphasized. Authoritarian welfare state, public goods provision are also regarded as playing a co-optation role for the mass instead of the elites. And in the digital era, propaganda, especially the internet and internet censorship, are also regarded as playing important role in maintaining the authoritarian rule. So there are huge amount of literature on different kinds of institutions that could help sustaining the authoritarian regimes. But all of this research also suffers some weaknesses. So one of them is that all of these institutions work, but all of these institutions require huge amount of money. And then the question is, where does the money come from, right? So co-optation means you should buy off either the elites and the mass, right? It costs huge amount of money. So where does the money come from? And theoretically, the institutional term for comparative authoritarianism is criticized of a lack of institutional theories, especially suffering the endogenous problem. Or in other words, these institutions, they could be manipulated by the autocrats. So we needed to build an institutional explanation that is not endogenous. And so my book tries to deal with these two problems. And then I turned to the taxation literature, and I found there has been, I mean, 10 years ago, when I started to revise my dissertation into a book, I realized there had been some literature, and most importantly, there's a paper by Slater and Fenner. It argues that the taxation regime plays a very important role in maintaining the authoritarian rules, mostly through the infrastructural state power mechanisms. So they developed a very comprehensive theoretical framework, like from extra revenue to support government functions, to collect informations, coercing rivals, and cultivating dependence. So first, when I read all of these literatures, I got really, I mean, on the one hand, very excited, but at the same time, I also got very frustrated because I thought there was nothing new left for me to do. I mean, theoretically new for me to do in my research. So I read more, and I try to read more of these literatures, these so-called fiscal sociology literatures by Schumpeter and Weber. And I felt I was lost. There's no way I can make some contribution until I realized that there are two taxation dilemmas facing autocrats when they try to raise their tax revenue. The first dilemma is the growth dilemma, which I will elaborate both of them in minutes. The second one is the representation dilemma. And for authoritarian rulers, it's there is a trilemma facing them. So there are three different policy goals. One is tax revenue maximization. The second one is economic growth, and the third one is kind of like maintaining their power with or suppressing representation, right? And it's really hard to achieve three of them at the same time. So the question is, how could the Communist Party achieve three of them at the same time, at least so far? Okay, so for the growth dilemma, so this is related to the neo-institutionalism, right? Like Douglas North. So there's so the autocrats facing tax maximization and economic growth. So if the government tax too much, then the economy will stagnate. Right? As Douglas famously claimed, the state is the solution, but at the same time also the problem for economic growth. So how could the party achieve some kind of like equilibrium between tax revenue growth and economic growth? The second dilemma is the representation dilemma. So when the state tries to tax the citizens will fight back, right? So I think as one colleagues of one of the next colleague, Wilson Pritchard, book argues that there's always a tax bargaining. The forms of tax bargaining could be uh, various, but there's always some kind of tax bargaining happening. So when the government tax the citizens will fight back, they will resist paying taxes. So some kind of representation would happen. Okay, so how could the Communist Party so far kind of like avoid this trilemma? And so in my examination of China's taxation, I find that the Chinese tax state is kind of like characterized by three important elements. So one is fiscal federalism, and the second is the Chinese tax state is a half tax state, and thirdly, the tax administration is under institutionalized. Now I will go through them like one by one. And to make the argument, I used a mixed methods design. So firstly, I take China as an ideal case, as I just mentioned, and I use in-depth case studies, especially through a process tracing of one county, what happened in the county for the last like 40 years. And then I do some comparative case studies using both the methods of agreement and difference to examine like the valuations between counties and also the similarities among them. And then I conducted a quantitative study to test the hypotheses developed based on the comparative case studies. Because I always got the question from the readers or the workshop attendants who asked me, okay, China is such a huge country. How could you say China is like this or China is like that, just based on your evidences in like 2 or like 5 counties? And then my answer is that, okay, so there's data from like 1,000 counties or more, and here the data shows that this is China. Okay, so the major cases come from 2 counties. One the one county one river is from Zhejiang, and the county Cold Mountain is from Shanxi. So I kind of like compare I control the GDP per capita or economic development level and focus on the industry or the asset mobility or the country's major industries, and then to see which one could explain the governance quality better. And then I also collected another 5 secondary cases. So I went all of the 5 counties for like some counties for like 1 week, some other counties for like 3 weeks, but I could not collect enough data to do like a deep comparison. So kind of like I present the secondary cases to complement the other 2 primary cases. Okay, so now I go to the 3 mechanisms. So first is fiscal federalism or the de facto fiscal federalism. So there has been huge amount of literature discussing China's fiscal decentralization and decentralization. My perspective is related with them, but from a different perspective. So here I divide the China's economic history, PRC's economic history into three major stages associated with fiscal reform, right? So the first one is the planned economy before 1980s, and then under the second stage is under the first fiscal reform, the fiscal decentralization, and the third one is under the tax share system. But my perspective is from the type of tax state or the sources of the fiscal revenue the government collected from the society. Because we don't have enough time to go through the details, so mainly before the 1980, China had a communist state, which means the state relied mostly on state-owned enterprises and collective production in rural areas for tax revenue. And then China had a very highly decentralized fiscal system, so which means the local governments was the tax farmers, and there was like huge amount of rampant extra budgetary fund. And after the tax share reform, the Chinese government tried to rationalize both its fiscal system and its bureaucratic system. So in the process tracing of the county one river, I tried to I also divided it into these like three different stages, and then tracing let me see the local government's strategies of development, and with a focus on how the local government's efforts to collect tax revenue is related or motivated their efforts to rebuild its bureaucratic system. And one of these most important effort is so if we follow Max Weber's theory of bureaucracy, what we can see here is the change of the physical dimension of bureaucratization in China in the last 40 or 50 years. It's mostly about how the Chinese local bureaucracy get funded, whether they kind of like collect their own fiscal revenue and spend the money, or whether it's the government that collected the revenue and then assigns the fiscal revenue to different bureaucrats. So this is a process of bureaucratization. Okay, and I find that during this process of bureaucratization, what we can find is that there's like the change of asset mobility from low to high, and then again, unfortunately, go back to low fiscal revenue due to the rise of the real estate industry and the land revenue, which somehow weakens the bureaucratization process to some degree. And so after the chapter 3, which I did the process tracing, in chapter 4 I did this comparative case studies of this majorly the two primary cases, but also added some evidences from the 5 complementary cases, and try to develop some kind of like causal relations between asset mobility and the governance quality. And then I do the large analysis, try to test the hypothesis based on that. Okay, so okay. And then I discuss the theoretical implication based on this bureaucratization and the marketization and how the state and the market co-evolved. So it's kind of like I engaged with Professor Yuan Ang's like co-evolution theory, but I try to provide some new insights from physical sociology. Now let's turn to the second mechanism, so which is China's half-tech state. Uh, so for the fiscal federalism, it's more about the central-local fiscal relationship, and this half-tech state, its focus is more on the sources of fiscal revenue. So you can imagine, so if you compare China with Canada or compare China with the United States, there's one big difference is that Chinese government's fiscal revenue, at least 1/3 of China, its fiscal revenue comes from non-tax revenue. So most importantly, it's the land-related revenue. So the Chinese government, the Chinese local government sell the land and then get the revenue. But at the same time, there are also like fees, fines, and others, like all of these add up to like more than 1/3 of the fiscal revenue. And among the tax revenue, so the Chinese government collected about 20% of the GDP as tax revenue. But within this revenue, about more than 60% of them are indirect taxes. So it's kind of also another interesting comparison between China and Canada and the United States. At the same time, the state-owned enterprises paid about 1/3 of the revenue. So following Professor Ma Jun, who is now kind of like one of the he now serves as the 统战部部长 of Beijing Municipal Party Committee. But when he was a professor at Zhongshan Daxue, like he developed this half-tech state concept to describe China's tax state, and I just followed his definition, and it's kind of like very helpful. And then we find that this half-tax state very significantly reduced Chinese citizens' tax perception. So here's, if we check the tax fairness perception, we find that more than half of Chinese citizens, they have no idea about their tax burdens. And only like less than 7% of them think their tax payment is too high compared to their peers. And compared to the public services received, less than 10% of them think that they pay too much taxes, with like about 2/3 of Chinese citizens have no ideas about their tax burdens. Right, so the half-tax state implicates for the regime resilience. First is that the state get a very high autonomy because it avoided most of the tax bargaining, right? So there's citizens because the citizens didn't perceive their tax burdens, therefore they don't demand for kind of like political participation or representation. But it also has some negative effects, mostly for the economic development, because the taxation system is very regressive, and therefore it's inefficient, and it leads to very high level of inequality, and at the same time, land revenue leads to corruption and very high housing prices. And very recently, the local government debt becomes a very serious challenge to Chinese government. As I mentioned, this book has been been published 4 years ago. So in the last 4 years, I I did some following up research, try to further develop this argument, especially based on this half tax state and the citizens' perception of their tax burden, and then their political demand. So I've worked with Bruce Dixon and published a paper on Chinese urban residents' tax consciousness, and also I'm working with Bruce and Wang Zhihao on a paper titled "As Pennies from Heaven: Regional Fiscal Structure, Fiscal Illusion, and Regime Support in Urban China." So, which tries to explain the Chinese citizens' different levels of regime support for different levels of government based on the fiscal structures. And also, I'm working with one of my PhD students doing another research, try to examine the tax participation linkage in China. It's also about how the half tax state reduce Chinese citizen tax perception and then their political demand. Okay, now let's turn to the third mechanism. This is about the tax administration. So we talked about the central local fiscal relationship. We are talked about the sources of fiscal revenue, and now let's move to tax administration. And the Chinese tax administration is under institutionalized. And if we follow the slogan representation through taxation or no taxation without representation, it seems that in China there is some representation through taxation because it's the enterprises that pay most of the tax revenue in under the half tax state. So therefore, these enterprise owners or the private entrepreneurs, they are entering the People's Congress, the Chinese legislature, and the People's Political Consultant Conference or the Renmin Zhenxie. And in local level, some of them even are members of the local party committee. So it seems like there's a story of representation through taxation, right? I'm paying taxes, I'm paying lots of taxes, and now I'm a representative, right? But a deeper look of the People's Congress and People's Political Consultant Conference, we find that it's not about story about representation. It's even not a story about co-optation. It's more about a story of patron clientelism. All these rich people, they are on the one hand they are paying taxes, on the other hand they become the representatives. But what are their motivations to being elected? Right. So as Yue Hou argues, like they get into the public office for their private interest. And my field studies find that one deep motivation for these private entrepreneurs is that they want to protect themselves from predatory taxation, or some of them want to get some privileges in the taxation system. So this is why I called the taxation system as under institutionalized. So first, the Chinese tax law and bylaws set very high nominal tax rates. So in my interviews, most of the people, I mean, some of them are tax officers, some of them are private entrepreneurs. They would tell me that if you pay all of these taxes, you will make no profits or you'll even go bankrupt, right? So the tax rates are too high. So effectively, it's kind of like unenforceable. So therefore, it leaves tax officers with very high discretionary power. And the Chinese government collect taxes based on targets set by supervisors, especially by the central government, and then divided into low levels rather than taxpayers' tax liabilities. So Professor Wei Cui at UBC has published a book on also get details on of this tax system. So then the problem is that if there's rampant tax evasion, then and the selective implementation, the tax implementation could be a very effective tool for legal repression. And therefore, there's institutionally generated fear among Chinese citizens, especially among the Chinese private entrepreneurs. So therefore, they look into build some patron-clientelism linkage instead of like ask for representation. Okay, so now let's draw the conclusion. So based on these empirical studies and the mechanical analysis, I built this endogenous institutional explanation of authoritarian resilience based on how the taxation system kind of like solves the dilemmas, economic growth dilemma and the representation dilemma, and which kind of like empower the Communist Party. And in the conclusion, I also did some historical comparison, compare contemporary China with like Ming China or Qing China, and then compare China with other post-communist and developing countries, and try to get some like kind of like more general conclusions. Okay, so I think I'm taking like a few more minutes, so I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Changdong. So just to reiterate your point that is could be commonly understood for general audience. So you're saying that effective tax rate in China is actually very, very high. And people that you interview, entrepreneurs that you interview have told you that if they pay taxes judiciously according to the rules, then they will not be able to make a profit.
Well, most of them. I mean, because it depends on the industries they are in, right? So I mean, but for the private entrepreneurs, most of their industries are in very low profit, uh, low margin profit industries. So therefore, they are unable to afford the taxes. And now the new challenge is that they also need to pay also all of the social security fund. So that's kind of like even a heavier burden than taxes.
Right. And you show some survey results showing that most of the Chinese citizens, that 50 to 60% of the respondents have got no idea what their tax burden is. What do you think it really means? Does it mean that a lot of tax burden is actually hidden, a lot of informal taxes, so that people may be paying kind of low formal taxes, but in totality, formal plus informal, they may be paying a little bit more. Is that what the survey results are suggesting?
Uh, yes. So it's a survey conducted by Bruce Dixon and Shen Mingming 10 years ago. At that time, I mean, surveys were still like face-to-face surveys were still possible, feasible at that time. So in the paper, Bruce and I published we go to the details. So basically, it's about the visibility of taxes. So because most of the taxes in China is indirect taxes, like they are the value-added taxes, we have no ideas about how much we paid. For example, like I don't know like how much taxes I paid with my like Huawei phone, right? Because and also, I mean, like in Canada or in the United States, when you go to, for example, a restaurant, if you have a dinner, then when you get the receipt, you know this is the price, this is the tax, this is the tip, right? But in China, like uh, like this is the price, this is the total price. We don't know like which part is the tax which part is the tip, right? So everything is mixed up. So and only less than 10% of Chinese citizens pay their individual income tax. And in the year of the survey, even the individual income tax was invisible because the employers will pay the tax for you, like the employees, like me, like I studied taxes, I studied taxation. Like I got no idea about how much I paid as my individual income tax until very recently.
Oh, that opaque. Okay, very good. Well, let's invite our discussant, Professor Ling Chen, to offer her thoughts on the book.
Okay. Thanks very much, Lynette. Can you guys still hear me? Can you hear me? You can hear me fine. Sorry, I just suddenly, like my screen just suddenly froze, and so so I think let me start by highlighting several of the most important and valuable contribution of this book. I have this book right here too, and this is like the second or third time I read this very excellent book. So I highly recommend to everyone. So the book goes beyond the issue of taxation alone, even though it is a book about taxation, but it sort of tackles the essential governance problem faced by a lot of the authoritarian regimes. That is, the authoritarian regime have to exercise social control, have to solicit cooperation, and also have to discipline their local agents. And most of the authoritarian regime, not every one of them, but a lot of the authoritarian regime rest their legitimacy on economic growth. So within this context, what taxation has to need to face is exactly, I think it's exactly the dilemma that Professor Zhang has mentioned, that it needs maximize the taxation, have the taxpayer to submit the tax, but then it also need to preserve economic growth and not overly tax them because they need to preserve source of legitimacy, and simultaneously there's might be demand for political representation or solve it in their own way. Professor Zhang has showed how China's institutional taxation was able to somewhat alleviate these problems, if not fundamentally solve it. And I wouldn't repeat those, but I find a lot of these findings sometimes sporadically exist in some of the literature, but it was not taken seriously before, and now they're all like so this book comprehensively talked about each single aspect, such as inter-regional tax competition, how that sort of constrains government's predatory behavior, and the co-optation of entrepreneurs into local people's congress, and how the sort of government can selectively punish those evade taxes. Essentially, when I interview business myself, everybody evade tax, and corporate income tax used to be 15% for foreign firms and 33% for domestic firms. And after 2008, it changed to approximately 25% for both foreign and domestic. But still, it is a very, relatively speaking, a very high interest tax rate that everyone trying to avoid. So it's really up to the tax bureau to say who you want to go after. So I find this mechanism to be really fascinating, and previously hardly anyone has captured this mechanism in such great detail, in such depth, through both quantitative and qualitative work. I do have a few of questions, only a few that I wanted to raise here. If business join local people's congress was largely a way of building political connections and patron-client relationship, then can we say that China has even partially solved the taxation without representation problem? Because this is not a representation. I mean, as you acknowledged on page 151, that the presence of private entrepreneur deputies in the local People's Congress leads to clientelism and co-optation rather than representation of government responsiveness. Or can we argue that, representation actually is less of an issue given that relatively low level of tax consciousness, like a lot of people like they go on the street, let's say you see the huge infrastructure or construction project, but they hardly will think, oh, this is using our tax money to build that, right? They don't have that strong level of tax consciousness. And if this case, the scenario is a strong state and weak society, to kind of flip what Joe McDowell's formulation is, then would it be relatively speaking, would it be easy to solve the representation dilemma that you highlighted for taxation problem? And if such patron-client relationship is the key, one of the key for sustaining such relationship, then I wonder what happened under the current leadership, the current administration, especially since 2013 or 2014. I also want to push you to think about the broader comparative context that you mentioned in your book, but didn't get time to mention here, that is China, to what extent China is comparable with Russia. That China is, of course, China is less penetrated by sort of kind of personnel wealth building mechanism that Russia has a sort of personal power directly connected to the Kremlin and Putin, right? China is just so China perhaps is more institutionalized than Russia. That's my guess, but I don't know. So if you could give us some comparative picture, that would be great too. But given the time limit, I will stop right here.
Very good. So I'll just echo what Professor Chen has just said about the importance of taxation. It's a really important topic, I think, in understanding the system in China, and very, very few people has actually worked on it systematically as Changdong has. I also have a follow-up question. So from the perspective of taxation without representation, so you talk about kind of half institutionalization. If the CCP makes taxation more institutionalized, makes it more transparent, do you think it would actually invite tax resistance and rebellion? Because people say that, I don't have this sort of public goods, I don't have representation, and why am I paying so much taxes? So I'll leave it here. You have about 10 minutes to address the questions, and possibly some questions from Q&A too, from the audience. But the floor is yours.
Okay, so I'll quickly answer your questions, like in maybe 2 or 3 minutes before, or I can accept new question. Okay,
sure. We have about 11 minutes. So
okay, so
do whatever you like.
Okay, so thank Ling and Lynette for your comments and questions. So I think for the representation question, both of you actually raised the question. So one is the representation question, a problem related to the private entrepreneurs and also related to Chinese citizens, especially if the Chinese taxation system get institutionalized or like more visualizable. So we are Chinese citizens demand for more representation. So that's actually the 2 papers I'm now working on. So on like how the tax perception. So if a citizen perceive their tax burden, so will they demand for more political participation, and or another paper is like more related on, it's kind of like part like a natural experiment. So because in the year of 2018 or 2019, the Chinese government reformed its individual income tax. So now we have so like the Americans and the Canadians, we also needed to pay also needed to fill the tax return. Let me check where the APP is. So now we have this individual income tax APP. So in the APP, we also needed to claim for like kind of like how much taxes we paid and maybe how much tax deduction we have, right? So we are doing like another study, try to examine whether this individual income tax reform, which very significantly increased its visibility to Chinese citizens, change Chinese citizens' demand for social welfare programs. So before realizing that you are paying taxes, you may have lower demand, but now you realizing you are paying taxes, you may increase your demand for government like responsibilities, right? So all of this may not necessarily be like voting or election like these Western ideas about participation, but they should have some kind of like implication for Chinese citizens' demand from the government. And I think Lin raised a very important and interesting question like about the China-Russian comparison. Because I have very limited knowledge about Russian politics, but yeah, but I think this would be a very interesting topic to work on, especially now we just have a new faculty member who's doing studies on Russian and other post-communism countries. So I will talk to him and to see whether there are some possibilities of like writing a paper. So thank you.
Okay, very good. But speculation on Russia. I think in Russia, the government collects a lot of resource rent, right? And I would imagine the tax system is also half institutionalized because you have a lot of oligarchs who don't pay taxes that they are supposed to. So the system may not actually be so different from China, I would imagine. Any thoughts, Ling?
Well, I think it's not let me put it that way. It's not about precisely about what happened with taxation. I think probably we would situate the taxation with a broader conversation about state business relations, because I haven't seen any like specific study of comparing taxation. I mean, please forget my ignorance. Like I myself haven't seen this saying, okay, comparing taxation of these two countries. I have not seen that. But I guess, probably makes sense to compare the state business relations, which is, I still think there's more personal wealth accumulation, penetration, or whatever. A couple years ago, I was having this conversation with some other scholars, and we felt like perhaps so in Russia more, and in China, and probably that can have some ramifications down the road. Yeah, so basically, it's a case where mostly you will find the comparison to be really relevant, but it's still not quite the same.
Sure. And Changdong, you mentioned the point that taxation could be an instrument of control for the party. Can you elaborate on that? Like from the Russian perspective, how does it actually work?
Oh yeah, so because so it's a kind of like for the Communist Party, the private enterprises and the private entrepreneurs kind of like on the one hand become a very valuable contribution to the economy. As Xi Jinping summarized, like it's kind of like 5、6、7、8、9, right? Like contributes to more than half of the tax revenue, contributes like 90% of the urban employment and so on, right? So it's kind of like a very, very important source or I mean the dynamic for economic growth for the party on the one hand. On the other hand, as many I mean, as the modernization theory and as, I mean, Barrington Moore, kind of like they would argue that this like capitalists, they may challenge the party state in some way, right? So what I find is that like and also like Kelly Tsai's book like on how the party deal with this like capitalists like but from the perspective of taxation, I find that the taxation is kind of like a very useful and effective tool for this like legal repression. It's like a selectively legal repression. On the one hand, it's legal, right? So in the book, I used the case of Ai Weiwei, who's like an artist.
Right.
Kind of like Ai Weiwei was like arrested before when he departed to, I think, Germany for some kind of like exhibition at the airport. And then, I mean, because he was such a famous artist, then the party realized that they needed to face all of these critics, right? So, and it turned out it was the tax and the vice head of the tax bureau of Chaoyang district who showed up and said, okay, there's no political reasons that we arrest Ai Weiwei. We kind of like arrested him because he evaded a huge amount of taxes, right? And this was like about kind of like tens of millions RMB. So kind of like it's a very effective like a tool for legal repression. Because like when you are taking advantage of the system, like you cannot challenge the system.
Yes, it's like, everyone has a skeleton in the closet, but when you do things that the party does not like, then, they will, find some evidence and
Right.
case against you. Yeah. Well, on that sad note, unfortunately, we will have to end our virtual book talk today. I want to thank the speakers, Professor Zhang, for getting up early and joining us from Beijing, and also Professor Chen from joining us from Washington, D.C. So good evening to everybody, and thank you for attending. See you next time. Bye-bye.
I want
Thank
to especially thank Lynette for having me here. It's really my honor. And thanks Changdong for sharing his book. I've known Changdong for 22 years, and this is the first time I'm on the same panel with him. Well, aside from back in Beijing, this is the first time that in a North America panel, we're together on the same panel. But anyway, thanks
Very
everyone.
good. We will have to continue this conversation in Beijing soon.
Yeah, sure.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.